amongst certain sections of the Japanese security establishment, there is a genuine deep down fear that China might one day do to Japan what Japan did to China. Okay, so they're motivated by this, not only guilt but fear. Something that's new, but in many ways, again, more things change, the more they stay the same, is the Shangri-La Security Dialogue that recently concluded in Singapore, and Pete Hegseth gave a speech, the keynote speech, and that attracted all sorts of attention for quite interesting and different reasons, didn't it? One topic was actually what he didn't say or what he didn't mention, and he didn't once mention Taiwan at all, which of course drew quite a lot of attention from the usual hawks in Washington, of course, but also from certain sections of the political establishment on the island itself, where there are clearly growing concerns that the United States is, in the medium term, not tomorrow, but really the path has been set, is really not a reliable defense or security partner, and that a new reality is beginning to emerge in Asia, and that's a very discomforting experience for those who became very comfortable with old realities, whether they're in Taipei or whether they're in Manila, or in fact whether they're in Seoul or Tokyo or Australia for that matter.
Let's revisit the Shangri-La forum for a second. What is interesting is the speech was given by the Japanese defense minister Koizumi. He is particularly aggressive. I mean, more so than Americans in kind of shifting the blame on China for supposedly stirring up the tensions in the region. And he's trying to also Japan is trying to they're working with Philippines on drawing maritime boundaries, which is news to me. I did not know Japan borders the Philippines, because there's a whole island of Taiwan that sits in between the Okinawa island chain and the Philippine islands. So this is obviously was rigorously objected by China. And in response, I think there's the Filipino defense minister made a speech about how Japan has been unfairly vilified and blamed, and say Japan is actually a model, has been a model world citizen. We shouldn't place unwarranted blame on Japan, for its past history. Let bygones fight bygones. And look at Japan today. Japan is behaving perfectly. So, again, this is like a barbed aim at China, of course, because China always raised the specter that Japan is trying to remilitarize. What do you make of that? What do you make out of that?
Well, let's see if I can cover all of those points. In terms of the Philippines defense minister's sort of broad remarks, I think the first thing to note is that it's widely understood by those in the Philippines and also those who watch Filipino politics closely that he is basically Washington's man in Manila. Okay, so that's the first thing to remember. The second thing that I would suggest is that next time he contemplates letting the Japanese off the hook for their historical atrocities, that he also makes his way to find the descendants of the 100,000 or so Filipinos that were killed by the Japanese during the course of the Second World War, and explain to them why it is that it's time for the Philippines to be as forgiving of the Japanese as he suggests that they should be. And perhaps if he did that, he may re-establish some meaningful connection with the sense of not only loss but also the sense of anger that some people will no doubt harbour towards the Japanese, particularly given that the Japanese have never actually, in any substantial and meaningful sense, atoned for the atrocities that they committed during the Second World War and in the decades prior. So that's the Philippines question. The Philippines and Japan ocean issue. Well, there's a couple of things I think that are worth just noting. Clearly, it's an orchestrated attempt to provoke China, and they're doing that for a range of reasons, I suspect. One is to prove their fealty to the American empire and all the things that the American empire has always stood for, which is to hold China back and contain China. And both the Philippines, or both the political elite in Manila and the government in Japan, of course, are confronting a changing Asian landscape that I think deeply worries them. For many decades, the Japanese and the Philippines have been part of the American security network. They've provided territory upon which the Americans have operated bases under extraterritorial provisions, and where American infrastructure and offensive capabilities, missiles and the like, have been established, and where American vessels and aeroplanes in the region can be serviced and supported in the event of conflict. So both Japan and the Philippines have been intertwined with this particular security architecture. The problem that they now confront is that this particular security architecture is demonstrably unviable. It's demonstrably unviable not for theoretical reasons, but for practical reasons that we've observed in the Middle East, where American bases have been systematically attacked, critically damaged, and some destroyed to a point where the Americans have had to withdraw their troops and their equipment from these bases. This experience, the Iranian attacks on these bases and the destruction of them, tells us a lot about the ways in which the security architecture premised on this network of forward bases is not viable. The Americans simply can't defend them. The idea in the past was that, of course, they were defendable and therefore they would be able to fulfill the functions assigned to them, logistics, etc., etc. Recent mathematical modeling based on known or American estimated Chinese missile inventories, known information about the 20-odd bases through Japan into the Philippines, the number of American airframes that are there, data on the number of hard shells and hangars that are there and how many planes are left out in the open, all point to an outcome where the United States would suffer within the first week of any intensive missile-based air conflict with the People's Republic of China, a level of loss of their basing infrastructure and their aeroplanes that would make it unviable for the United States to sustain a kinetic engagement in the Western Pacific. And I think the Filipinos and the Japanese actually understand this. Now, if your entire security mindset was premised on the idea that these bases were defendable and you realize that they're not, then a certain degree of alarm and panic sets in. And they're desperate to hold the Americans in to the region. A bit like the Ukrainians have been and the Europeans have been desperate to keep the Americans entangled in the war in Ukraine as well. They're concerned about being left on their own. At the same time, of course, the Americans are saying, you folk need to step up, you need to take on more responsibility, there are going to be no freeloaders. And what the Americans' message is, we're still here, we're in the backdrop, Don't worry about that. Americans can't quite walk away. But you can take on greater resourcing responsibility, and of course you can take on greater frontline risk as well. And if you're sitting there in the defense establishment and security establishment in Tokyo and the Philippines, none of this would give you any comfort whatsoever. So they're trying to, I think, demonstrate some level of fealty to the American empire and to all the things that they sort of all committed themselves to and invested in over the many decades. China, of course, is not going to let this attempt to draw some lines on the ocean map go without comment, because these lines obviously define territories, ocean territories that overlap exclusive economic zone territories that would extend from the east and southeast coast of the island of Taiwan, or the province of Taiwan. And of course, there may also be implications on China's sovereign territory as well. So what have we already seen? Obviously, some strong diplomatic words, Carl, but the real material response so far is an intensification of Chinese patrols. Not naval patrols. The naval ships have been, working there or doing their business in and around the island now for a long time. But we're going to start to see Coast Guard patrols intensify. Now, these are serious Coast Guard ships. These aren't the sort of 40-footers that we might see in other contexts. I mean, these are substantial ocean-faring vessels, and unsurprisingly, China's response is going to be to dispatch its Coast Guard to protect its own sovereign territory. And it's going to do the same, by the way, and it's already been doing some of this in and around the Diaoyu Islands, which are also disputed, and so a new normal. This is the legacy of the Pelosi effect, right? A new normal is going to be put into place with intensified People's Republic of China Coast Guard patrols of these areas. That simply wasn't the case 5 years ago. This reminds me, in a defense military context, of the blowback that happened when the Americans implemented the chips restrictions and the technology restrictions, right? Here was the plan. We're going to do X and Y should happen. Well, they did X and something else happened, but it certainly wasn't Y. And the same thing's happening here. They will end up with a near future, with greater Chinese activity and patrol vessel presence in these waters than ever before. And in some regards, sitting in Beijing, you do have to wonder whether or not these people are almost rolling out the red carpet every time they try to provoke China into something. It's foolhardy. The last thing I'll say on this, just very, very quickly, the Japanese defense minister, I don't think you need to say much about, the Japanese. They still haven't atoned for the atrocities that they committed, and I'll just leave it at that. The broader issue, though, about the Philippines and Japan is whether or not, in the context of this changing environment, they can figure out a way of behaving in a way that contributes to regional stability and peace, rather than trying to reinstigate the kind of bloc politics that was part and parcel of the Cold War era. I mean, that's the choice that they've actually got to make. Are they going to step up as adults in a changing world, or are they going to run around pretending somehow that they can, shirt front Beijing? Let's not forget that China is the only industrial superpower in the world. Right? Nobody has the industrial depth that China has. And if these countries think that somehow they're going to be a military match to China, they've got another thing coming. I think they understand that, right? So a lot of this is about theatre as well. But a little bit of reality wouldn't go astray amongst these folk. Speaking of reality, one last thing. Middle of March, oil crisis, of course. What does President Marcos do? He reaches out to Beijing and says, oh, maybe we should re-engage a little bit around joint exploration of some of the oil reserves in the South China Sea. Well, I think some lessons are going to get learned as time goes by, and that is that you don't get to have your cake and to keep it as well. So that's the Philippines and Japan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really actually surprised at the time when United States looks like it's withdrawing from East Asia, at least a tactical pivot away. Japan is really cranking up the rhetoric against China. Starting with, this Japan has been playing that role for a while, but it's really cranked up recently under the new administration of Sanai Takaichi.
Look, I think there's some fear, right, Carl? Look, when I speak to colleagues and friends in Japan, they tell me that amongst certain sections of the Japanese security establishment, there is a genuine deep down fear that China might one day do to Japan what Japan did to China. Okay, so they're motivated by this, not only guilt but fear. But the other thing is that there's a militarization there that suits a domestic agenda, and whilst in some ways, of course, whilst Japan remains an occupied country, let's not forget, there's 60,000 American troops in Japan. So it's an occupied country that the Japanese are trying to find a way where they can assert themselves as well. So there's many layers to all of this. One is to try to keep the Americans committed because they're worried that without the Americans, their fear of China will become real. But secondly, at the same time, they do also see this as a window of opportunity, because if the Americans, in a sense, say to the Japanese, you need to step up, the Japanese will willingly step up. The balancing act for the Americans in the end is, if their allies step up too much, then their allies will need them a lot less. And that's certainly not really what the Americans want. So the Americans are striking a balance here at the moment, leading from the rear, as I often say, engaging in what you called a sort of a tactical retrenchment. But I think they're cutting their operational cloth to suit without abandoning their strategic objectives, right? So the means-end calculus is changing. The ends haven't changed, China containment, but the means by which they pursue these objectives is being modified. And they're trying to get their networks of allies in and around the region to do a lot more heavy lifting. And of course, in the end, they want their allies to throw the bodies on the line as well. The last thing I think anyone would expect is that Washington will willingly send young American men and women into war 9,000 miles away from the mainland of America, and especially when you've got the bodies of others in the region to go and die on your behalf. It's hard to blame Washington for having that mindset, right? What's remarkable is that there is a political elite in these countries that somehow is willing to play along with this and throw the lives of their own young men and women on the line for what is actually America's priorities, not theirs.
Well, I mean, it's not that different from what the United States is doing in the Persian Gulf. I mean, the whole war against Iran, that really is to satisfy the strategic objective of Israel, not so much of the United States. And so there's different level of this kind of relationship. But U.S. is expecting these countries to be their meat shield and cannon fodders. Well, guess what? Israel expect America to play the same role for them, and the American leadership is willy-nilly, very willingly playing that role. And unfortunately, everybody else in the world, including average Americans, are paying the price.